She dragged her right leg slightly as she walked through the military hospital corridors, the Limp drawing snickers from young officers who had never seen real combat. They whispered behind her back about the broken-down civilian taking up space meant for real heroes. But when she bent forward to help a wounded veteran tie his shoes, her shirt pulled tight across her shoulders, revealing the unmistakable outline of scar tissue that ran from her left shoulder blade to her spine. General Marcus Hayes saw it from across the room and went completely white. That particular scar could only come from one thing: shrapnel from the IED blast that had earned someone the Medal of Honor 3 years ago in Afghanistan. The same blast that had killed 4 Marines and should have killed the woman who carried them out one by one while enemy fire tore through the night. The woman the Army had declared KIA when she vanished from the field hospital. The woman who was supposed to be dead. And she was standing 20 feet away, very much alive, working as a volunteer in a veterans rehabilitation center where no one knew her real name. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the Walter Reed Veterans Rehabilitation Center, casting long rectangles of light across the polished linoleum floors. The air smelled of antiseptic and determination, that unique combination of medical facility efficiency and the stubborn hope that defined places where broken bodies learned to function again. Sarah Chen limped through the front entrance at exactly 700, just as she had every morning for the past 6 months. Her right leg dragged slightly with each step, a barely perceptible hitch in her gait that she had long since stopped trying to hide. She wore simple civilian clothes, dark jeans, a plain gray sweater that hung loose on her frame, and worn sneakers that had seen better years. Nothing about her appearance suggested military background. Nothing marked her as someone who had ever worn a uniform or carried a weapon or made decisions under fire. She moved through the lobby with quiet purpose, nodding to the security guard who had learned her routine months ago, past the reception desk where volunteers signed in with cheerful efficiency, past the memorial wall lined with photographs of fallen service members, their faces young and determined, frozen in moments before the world taught them what sacrifice really cost. Sarah's eyes never lingered on the wall. She had her own memories of faces that would never age. The rehabilitation wing buzzed with morning activity. Physical therapists guided patients through exercises designed to rebuild what war had torn apart. Occupational specialists worked with veterans, learning to perform basic tasks with prosthetic limbs. Psychologists facilitated group sessions where warriors tried to translate combat experience into civilian language. It was systematic, professional, hopeful in the way that medical facilities had to be. Hopeful, even when hope felt like work. Sarah made her way to the equipment storage room where volunteers kept their supplies. She'd been assigned to mobility assistance, a clinical term for helping veterans with basic movement, walking practice, wheelchair navigation, the fundamental rebuilding of independence that came before everything else. It was work that required patience rather than expertise, presence rather than professional training. Work that anyone with a clean background check and a willingness to show up could perform. But the way Sarah moved through the space suggested something more than casual volunteer training. Her eyes tracked movement patterns automatically, cataloging who was where, noting changes in routine without conscious effort. She positioned herself with clear sightlines to entrances and exits. Her hands, when she reached for equipment, moved with precise economy. Small details that spoke of conditioning that went far deeper than civilian first aid certification. "Morning, Sarah," called Janet Mills, the volunteer coordinator, a cheerful woman in her 50s who had been organizing civilian helpers for over a decade. "You're early again." "Traffic was light," Sarah replied, her voice even and unremarkable. She had learned to modulate her tone carefully, to sound neither too military nor too civilian, to exist in the neutral space between identities where people stopped paying attention. Janet smiled and continued organizing paperwork. She liked Sarah. Reliable, competent, never called in sick, never created drama with the other volunteers. The kind of person who showed up consistently and did the work without needing recognition or praise. In a world of shifting schedules and volunteer burnout, Sarah Chen was a blessing that Janet had learned not to question too deeply. What Janet didn't know was that Sarah Chen wasn't her real name, that the background check had been carefully constructed by people with clearances Janet would never possess. That the woman she trusted to help wounded veterans learn to walk again had herself learned to walk again in a field hospital in Afghanistan, fighting through injuries that should have been fatal, driven by something more powerful than personal survival. But those were details that existed in classified files and redacted reports, and the memories of people who had been sworn to silence. Here, in this place, Sarah was just another volunteer. Someone who had shown up one day with the right paperwork and the right answers and a willingness to do work that most people found too emotionally difficult to sustain. She pulled on latex gloves and gathered the equipment she would need for morning sessions. Resistance bands, stability balls, parallel bars for walking practice, the tools of rebuilding, each one designed to help people relearn what they had once taken for granted. She arranged everything with methodical precision, the way someone arranged equipment when muscle memory came from places where mistakes had consequences measured in lives rather than inconvenience. The morning's first patient was Staff Sergeant Miguel Santos, a 28-year-old Marine who had lost his left leg below the knee to an IED outside Fallujah. He maneuvered his wheelchair into the therapy room with practiced efficiency, his upper body strength obvious from months of compensation training. His attitude was equally obvious, frustrated, impatient, and barely tolerating the assistance he needed but didn't want to accept. "Let's work on prosthetic transition today," Sarah said quietly, indicating the parallel bars where he could practice standing and walking with his new artificial leg. "Take your time finding your balance." Santos transferred from his wheelchair to the bars with controlled movements, his jaw tight with concentration and something that might have been anger. The prosthetic was still new enough to feel foreign, still awkward enough to remind him constantly of what he had lost. He took 3 careful steps, wobbled, and grabbed the bars harder than necessary. "This is bullshit," he muttered, not quite under his breath. 6 months of this, and I'm still walking like a drunk toddler." Sarah stepped closer, her own limp more pronounced as she moved. "Your body is still learning to trust the prosthetic. It takes time to build that neural connection." Santos looked at her leg, noting the way she favored her right side, the slight drag in her step. His expression shifted from frustration to something closer to contempt. "What would you know about it? You're just a volunteer. You've never been deployed, never been in combat, never had to relearn everything because some terrorist decided to blow up your convoy." The words hit the room like cold air. Other veterans in nearby therapy stations glanced over, some with sympathy for Santos's frustration, others with disapproval at his tone. But all of them had felt the divide between those who had served and those who hadn't, between those who understood war firsthand and those who only knew it from news reports and "thank you for your service" platitudes. Sarah's expression didn't change. Her voice remained steady, professional. "You're right. I don't know exactly what your experience has been, but I'm here to help you rebuild your mobility. That's what matters right now." Before Santos could respond, the therapy room door opened and a group of young officers entered on what appeared to be an administrative tour. 3 lieutenants and a captain, all pressed uniforms and polished shoes, the kind of clean appearance that spoke of stateside assignments and limited field experience. They moved through the space with the casual authority of people inspecting facilities they would never personally use. Captain Bradley Morrison noticed Santos immediately, the Marine's obvious struggle with his prosthetic, the sweat beading on his forehead from the effort of basic walking. Morrison's gaze then shifted to Sarah, taking in her civilian clothes, her limp, her position assisting what he clearly saw as a real hero dealing with real sacrifice. "Is this volunteer training adequate for this kind of work?" Morrison asked Janet Mills, who had joined the tour group. His voice carried just enough volume to ensure everyone in the room could hear. "It seems like these wounded warriors deserve assistance from people who actually understand what they've been through." One of the lieutenants, a young man named Hayes who had graduated from West Point 6 months ago and never seen anything more dangerous than a training exercise, nodded in agreement. "Seems like you'd want former military providing this kind of support, people who can relate to the experience." Their words were professional on the surface, but the implication was clear. Sarah was an outsider, a civilian playing at understanding military sacrifice, someone who had never earned the right to work with people who had given pieces of themselves for their country. Santos heard the exchange, and something ugly flickered across his face. The frustration he felt about his own limitations, the anger he carried about his injury, the resentment that built up from months of feeling helpless, all of it found a target in the woman with the limp who was trying to help him walk. "She's right," he said loudly enough for the officers to hear. "How is she supposed to teach me to walk when she can barely walk herself? What kind of joke is this? They put broken civilians in charge of helping broken soldiers." The room went quiet. Other veterans stopped their exercises. Therapists paused their instructions. The weight of the moment settled over everyone like heavy air before a storm. Sarah stood perfectly still, her hands at her sides, her expression unchanged. She had heard worse. She had endured worse. But hearing it here, in this place where she had come to find some kind of peace, some kind of purpose that didn't involve classified missions and moral gray zones, it hit differently. Captain Morrison stepped forward, his voice taking on the tone of someone delivering official judgment. "Ma'am, perhaps you should consider whether this is the most appropriate assignment for someone with your limitations. These men and women have sacrificed everything for their country. They deserve the highest standard of care." Lieutenant Hayes nodded again, more vigorously this time. "Maybe there's clerical work or something more suitable to your physical condition. Administrative support, filing, something that doesn't require—" He gestured vaguely at Sarah's leg, not finishing the sentence but making his meaning clear. Something that doesn't require actual physical capability, something hidden away where her inadequacy wouldn't be visible to real heroes who deserved better. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to Military and Veteran Stories so you never miss these true tales of courage. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? Janet Mills looked uncomfortable, caught between her knowledge of Sarah's consistent competence and the obvious authority of the military officers questioning her volunteers' qualifications. "Sarah has been one of our most reliable volunteers," she said diplomatically. "She's never had any issues with patients or therapy protocols." But her defense sounded weak against the visual evidence of Sarah's limp, against the assumption that physical limitation meant professional inadequacy, against the unspoken but clearly held belief that helping wounded veterans was work that should be reserved for people who had earned the right through their own service and sacrifice. Sarah absorbed it all in silence. The criticism, the judgment, the dismissal of her value based on surface observation and incomplete information. She had spent 6 months in this place, finding something that felt like peace, something that felt like purpose without the weight of classified operations and moral complexity. She had helped dozens of veterans take their first steps toward independence, had provided support and encouragement and the simple presence of someone who cared about their recovery. And now she was being told it wasn't enough, that she wasn't enough, that her own physical limitations disqualified her from helping others overcome theirs. But what none of them knew, what none of them could know, was that the limp they were mocking came from the same IED blast that had shattered her femur in 3 places while she was carrying her 4th wounded Marine to safety under enemy fire. That the scar tissue hidden beneath her loose sweater was proof of the shrapnel that had torn through her back and shoulder, injuries that should have killed her, but hadn't, because she was too stubborn to die before her mission was complete. What they couldn't know was that her understanding of physical limitation, of rebuilding strength, of learning to function despite permanent damage, that understanding came not from textbooks or training programs, but from her own journey back from injuries that had earned her the Medal of Honor and a place in the classified history of operations that officially never happened. But Sarah Chen, the name on her volunteer badge, the identity she wore like careful camouflage, said none of that. She simply stood there and took their judgment, their dismissal, their assumption that visible weakness meant actual inadequacy. Because sometimes the strongest thing you could do was let people underestimate you. Sometimes survival meant accepting their limitations rather than revealing your own capabilities. Sometimes the mission, even a mission as simple as helping veterans learn to walk, required you to be less than you were in order to accomplish more than they expected. The tour group moved on to examine other areas of the facility, their voices fading as they discussed budget allocations and staffing requirements. Santos continued his prosthetic practice with renewed aggression, as if proving his own toughness could somehow compensate for the awkwardness of the interaction. The other veterans in the room gradually returned to their exercises, but the tension remained, hanging in the air like smoke after a fire. Sarah quietly reset the parallel bars to their original position and began cleaning the equipment. Her movements were methodical, efficient, the kind of automatic maintenance that came from years of caring for gear that your life might depend on. She worked without speaking, giving Santos space to process his frustration without the pressure of forced interaction. 10 minutes later, as Santos struggled through another walking sequence, his artificial leg caught on an uneven section of the floor mat. He stumbled forward, off balance, his momentum carrying him toward a fall that would likely result in injury to his healing surgical site. The physics of the moment were clear. Too much forward motion, not enough time to recover, gravity and prosthetic mechanics working against him. Sarah moved, not consciously, not with deliberation, but with a kind of instant response that bypassed thought and went straight to muscle memory. She covered the distance between them in 3 steps that somehow didn't look hurried despite their speed. Her hands reached Santos exactly at his center of gravity, one on his shoulder, one at his hip, providing just enough support and redirection to allow him to catch himself on the parallel bars instead of hitting the floor. The entire sequence took less than 2 seconds. Santos found himself upright and stable, breathing hard from adrenaline and shock. Sarah stepped back immediately, giving him space, her expression neutral as if nothing unusual had happened. But Santos, who had spent months relearning balance and movement, who understood exactly how close he had come to a dangerous fall, stared at her with something approaching disbelief. The speed of her response, the precision of her positioning, the way she had seemed to understand his momentum and trajectory better than he did, none of it fit with his assumption that she was just another well-meaning civilian volunteer. "How did you?" he started to ask, then stopped, because admitting that she had probably saved him from serious injury meant acknowledging that maybe his earlier dismissal had been premature, maybe unfair. Sarah simply nodded toward the parallel bars. "Let's try that sequence again. This time, watch for the edge of the mat where it meets the tile. The height difference is about half an inch." Santos looked down. She was right. There was a slight elevation change where the exercise mat ended, barely visible, but enough to catch the edge of a prosthetic foot if you weren't paying attention. He had been using these bars for weeks and never noticed the potential hazard. "How did you see that?" he asked, his tone more curious than confrontational now. "I watch for things that could cause problems," Sarah replied simply. "Environmental hazards, balance points, potential failure modes. It becomes automatic after a while." The language she used was interesting. Environmental hazards, failure modes, not the vocabulary of civilian volunteer training, but the systematic risk assessment terminology that came from places where environmental awareness meant survival. Santos caught it, but didn't have context to understand what it meant. What he did understand was that Sarah had just demonstrated a level of situational awareness and physical competence that didn't match her supposed background. She moved like someone who had been trained to assess and respond to developing threats. She positioned herself like someone who understood body mechanics and force dynamics from practical experience rather than textbook study. 30 minutes later, as Santos was finishing his session, another veteran wheeled into the therapy room. Corporal Maria Rodriguez, a former Army medic who had lost the use of her legs when her field hospital was hit by rocket fire. Rodriguez was known for her sharp wit and her complete intolerance for what she called inspiration porn. Civilians who treated wounded veterans like objects of pity rather than human beings with agency and capability. Rodriguez immediately noticed the tension in the room, the way Santos kept glancing at Sarah with an expression that mixed confusion with grudging respect. "Everything okay in here, Santos?" "Yeah, just working on balance." Santos gestured vaguely at the parallel bars, then looked at Sarah. "She's good at catching problems before they become problems." Rodriguez studied Sarah with the systematic assessment that came from years as a combat medic. She noted the way Sarah held herself, upright despite the obvious leg issue, shoulders back in a posture that suggested core strength and deliberate conditioning. She noted the way Sarah's eyes tracked movement around the room without seeming to, the passive awareness that marks someone who had learned to monitor their environment as second nature. "You prior military?" Rodriguez asked directly. No point in dancing around the question. Sarah paused in her equipment organization. "No." Rodriguez raised an eyebrow. "Husband, family." "No." "Then how do you know to check his six when he's transferring weight? How do you know to position yourself at his center of gravity instead of just grabbing wherever you can reach?" The questions were specific, technical, based on movement principles that weren't covered in volunteer orientation. Sarah could deflect, could claim intuition or basic training. But something in Rodriguez's tone suggested that deflection would create more problems than honesty. "I've had physical therapy myself," Sarah said carefully. "You learn to think about balance and momentum when you're relearning how to move." It was true as far as it went. Sarah had spent months in military medical facilities, working with physical therapists who understood combat injuries and the specific challenges of rebuilding capability after trauma. But the way she said it suggested civilian injury, car accident maybe, something that would explain her limp without raising questions about military service. Rodriguez accepted the answer, but her expression remained thoughtful. There was something about Sarah that didn't quite add up. The way she moved, the terminology she used, the automatic environmental awareness, all of it suggested background that went deeper than civilian physical therapy. But Rodriguez also understood that some people had reasons for not talking about their past. The veterans community was full of stories that couldn't be told completely, experiences that existed in classified spaces or personal trauma that wasn't meant for public discussion. If Sarah wanted to keep her background private, that was her right. "Fair enough," Rodriguez said. "But for what it's worth, you've got good instincts, better than most of the volunteers we get through here." Sarah nodded her thanks and continued organizing equipment, but inside she felt something shift. Not relief exactly, but recognition. Rodriguez saw competence without needing to understand its source. Santos had experienced capability without requiring explanation. For the first time since the morning's confrontation, Sarah felt like maybe she belonged in this space after all. Maybe helping wounded veterans wasn't about having the perfect background or the right credentials. Maybe it was about showing up consistently and paying attention and being present when someone needed support. Maybe it was about understanding that healing looked different for everyone, and that sometimes the most helpful thing you could do was simply be there when someone stumbled. The afternoon brought more patients, more exercises, more opportunities for Sarah to demonstrate the quiet competence that had kept her alive through missions she could never discuss. Each interaction built on the previous one, creating a foundation of trust and respect that had nothing to do with her supposed limitations and everything to do with her actual capability. But what none of them knew was that the real test was still coming. That by evening, someone would arrive at the facility whose trained eye would see past the careful camouflage Sarah had constructed. Someone who would recognize not just competence, but the specific type of competence that came from a very particular kind of training and a very specific kind of experience. Someone who knew exactly what the scars hidden beneath her loose sweater meant and what they represented in terms of courage and sacrifice and the kind of heroism that was never meant to be acknowledged publicly. The afternoon was ending, but the real story was just beginning. At 15:47 hours, as the afternoon therapy sessions were winding down and the rehabilitation center had settled into its usual rhythm of quiet recovery, the fire alarm shattered the calm with 3 sharp blasts, followed by an automated announcement. "Code red. Building evacuation required. All personnel proceed to designated emergency exits immediately." The sound echoed through the corridors with mechanical urgency, but what followed was chaos. This wasn't a drill. The smell of smoke was already filtering through the ventilation system, acrid and chemical, suggesting an electrical fire somewhere in the building's infrastructure. Emergency lighting flickered on as the main power systems began shutting down automatically. In the rehabilitation wing, panic set in immediately. 23 veterans in various stages of recovery, half of them with mobility limitations that made rapid evacuation complicated. Wheelchairs, walkers, prosthetics, patients connected to monitoring equipment that couldn't simply be abandoned. The normal evacuation procedures assumed mobile populations and clear exit routes. This was neither. Janet Mills, the volunteer coordinator, stood frozen in the main therapy room doorway, her clipboard clutched against her chest, her face pale with the realization that her emergency training had never covered this scenario. How do you evacuate people who can't walk quickly? How do you prioritize when everyone needs assistance? How do you make decisions about medical equipment versus human mobility when seconds matter? "Everyone stay calm," she called out, her voice shaking despite her attempt at authority. We need to follow the evacuation plan." But there was no plan for this. Not really. The facility's emergency protocols were designed for fire department response, sprinkler systems, and standard civilian evacuation. They weren't designed for a population where half the people couldn't move independently and the other half were dealing with psychological trauma that made sudden chaos potentially triggering. Staff Sergeant Santos, still in the parallel bars where he had been working on his prosthetic gait, looked around with growing alarm. The smell of smoke was getting stronger. The emergency lighting cast strange shadows that made depth perception difficult. His artificial leg, which he was still learning to trust, suddenly felt like a liability rather than a tool. "Where's the fire?" he demanded. "How much time do we have? What's the fastest route out of here?" Janet didn't have answers. Her training covered volunteer coordination and patient interaction, not emergency command and crisis management. She was a civilian administrator caught in a situation that required military-grade decision-making under pressure. Corporal Rodriguez wheeled herself toward the main exit, then stopped abruptly. The corridor beyond was filling with smoke, thick gray clouds that suggested the fire was between them and the primary evacuation route. She spun her wheelchair around, her combat medic training automatically switching into assessment mode. "Primary. Exit is compromised," she announced in the clear, projected voice she had used in field hospitals under fire. "We need alternatives, secondary exits, emergency routes, anything that gets us away from the smoke." Her tone cut through the rising panic, providing the kind of calm authority that people could focus on instead of the fear that was threatening to overwhelm rational thought. But authority without capability was just noise, and Rodriguez knew her limitations. She could assess, she could communicate, but she couldn't physically evacuate people who needed assistance moving. Other veterans began gravitating toward her voice, recognizing the command presence that came from someone who had made life-and-death decisions under pressure. But gathering around Rodriguez just created a more concentrated problem. 20-plus people in a space that was filling with smoke, with limited exits and no clear leadership structure to coordinate movement. That's when Sarah stepped forward. Not dramatically, not with announcements or declarations, but with the kind of quiet authority that came from someone who had managed crisis situations where hesitation meant casualties. She moved to the center of the room, her limp forgotten, her entire bearing shifting into something that hadn't been visible during months of careful civilian camouflage. "Rodriguez, I need you to coordinate communication," she said in a voice that carried absolute certainty. "Anyone with a working cell phone, call 911 and give them our exact location, the number of mobility-limited personnel, and the fact that primary exits are compromised. Make sure they know we need ambulances for potential smoke inhalation and specialized equipment for wheelchair evacuation." Rodriguez responded instantly, not because she had been ordered, but because the instruction made perfect tactical sense and came from someone who clearly knew what they were talking about. She began organizing the mobile veterans into a communication network, each person making specific calls to ensure emergency responders had complete information. "Santos," Sarah continued, "you and anyone else who can move independently are going to be stretcher bearers. We're going to improvise evacuation assistance for people who can't move quickly on their own. Take those exercise mats, those resistance bands, anything we can use to create portable support systems." Santos stared at her for a moment, processing the transformation. This was not the same person who had been quietly helping him with balance exercises an hour ago. This was someone who thought in terms of tactical logistics and resource utilization, someone who saw a crisis and immediately began breaking it down into manageable components with specific solutions. "What about the staff?" Santos asked. "Janet, the therapists, the people who were supposed to be in charge?" Sarah glanced around the room. Janet was still standing frozen, overwhelmed by the scope of the emergency. The ETU physical therapists were trying to help individual patients, but had no coordination system. The support staff were following their standard protocols, which involved waiting for emergency responders rather than taking initiative. "They're not trained for this," Sarah said simply. "We are." The statement hung in the air for a moment. We are. Not you are or I am, but we are. The recognition that everyone in this room had been trained to function under pressure, to make decisions when normal systems failed, to prioritize mission success over personal safety. They were wounded, they were recovering, they were dealing with their own limitations, but they were still operators. Still people who understood that when things went bad, you adapted and improvised and kept moving forward. Sarah turned to address the room as a whole, her voice carrying the kind of calm authority that made people listen without question. "Listen up. The fire is between us and the main exit. We have approximately 10 to 15 minutes before smoke concentration becomes dangerous, possibly less. We're going to execute a tactical evacuation using the service corridor that runs behind the kitchen. It's longer, but it avoids the compromised area." She pointed toward a door at the far end of the room that most people had never noticed. "That leads to the service area. The corridor is wide enough for wheelchairs and has direct access to the loading dock, which puts us outside and away from the building. We're going to move in teams with mobile personnel assisting non-mobile, and we're going to do this in order of medical priority." Rodriguez looked up from coordinating phone calls. "How do you know about the service corridor?" Sarah's expression didn't change. "I pay attention to building layouts. Comes in handy during emergencies." It was a reasonable answer that didn't fully explain how she knew the weight capacity of the service elevator, the width clearances of the corridor doors, and the exact route from their current position to the loading dock. Knowledge that suggested familiarity with emergency planning and tactical facility assessment that went far beyond casual observation. But there wasn't time for questions. The smoke was getting thicker, and people were starting to cough. Sarah moved through the room with systematic efficiency, organizing evacuation teams, assigning specific roles to people based on their capabilities, turning a potential disaster into a coordinated operation. Team 1. Rodriguez leads communication and triage. Anyone with respiratory issues, cardiac conditions, or medication dependencies gets priority evacuation. Team 2, Santos and the other mobile personnel become assist teams for wheelchair users and people who need physical support. Team 3, walking wounded and independent mobility take the rear, helping carry emergency supplies and ensuring no one gets left behind. She assigned tasks with the precision of someone who had done this before, who had managed evacuations under pressure, and understood the human factors that could turn organized withdrawal into deadly chaos. People responded to her directions not because they had been ordered to, but because the instructions made sense and came from someone who clearly knew what they were doing. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more inspiring military stories like this one. Within 3 minutes, what had been panic had transformed into purposeful movement. Rodriguez coordinated with emergency responders while simultaneously organizing medical priority lists. Santos and 2 other ambulatory veterans created improvised stretchers using exercise equipment and began assisting the most mobility-limited patients. The walking wounded formed a support chain, passing supplies and ensuring no one was forgotten. And Sarah moved through it all like the calm center of a controlled storm, adjusting plans as conditions changed, solving problems as they arose, maintaining the kind of steady leadership that kept people focused on solutions rather than fear. But what was becoming clear to everyone who watched her work was that this wasn't improvised leadership. This was practiced command presence, the kind that came from someone who had managed life and death situations before, who had been trained to function when normal systems failed, who knew how to organize people under pressure because she had done it in places where the stakes were much higher than a building fire. As the first evacuation team began moving toward the service corridor, Santos looked at Sarah with an expression that mixed amazement with growing suspicion. "You've done this before." It wasn't a question. Sarah met his eyes steadily. Everyone deserves to get home safe. Let's make sure that happens. She turned back to coordinating the evacuation, but Santos continued staring at her, his mind working through the evidence that had been accumulating all afternoon. The way she moved, the terminology she used, the automatic threat assessment, the instant command presence when crisis hit. This wasn't a civilian volunteer who had learned a few things from physical therapy. This was an operator, someone with tactical training and crisis management experience, and the kind of calm competence that only came from places where hesitation meant casualties. But who was she really? And why was she here, pretending to be something she clearly wasn't? The answers to those questions would come soon enough, because evacuating the building was only the first crisis of the day. The real test was still ahead, when someone with the right clearance and the right background would see Sarah in action and recognize not just her capability, but the specific type of training that had created it. Someone who would know exactly what it meant when a supposed civilian volunteer could organize a tactical evacuation with the precision of a special operations officer. Someone who might recognize the scars that she kept hidden beneath her loose clothing and understand what those scars represented in terms of service and sacrifice and heroism that was never meant to be acknowledged publicly. The service corridor evacuation proceeded with mechanical efficiency. Sarah's improvised teams moved through the narrow hallways like a well-rehearsed operation, each person understanding their role, each group maintaining communication with the others. What should have been chaos had become controlled movement. What could have been disaster had transformed into successful crisis management. As they emerged through the loading dock into the cool afternoon air, emergency vehicles were already arriving. Fire trucks, ambulances, a hazmat unit responding to reports of chemical smoke. The building's emergency systems had triggered automatically, but the human response, getting everyone out safely, had been managed by Sarah's tactical organization rather than standard evacuation protocols. Paramedics immediately began triaging evacuees, checking for smoke inhalation, monitoring anyone with pre-existing medical conditions. The veterans who had been evacuated sat on benches and loading dock edges, catching their breath, processing what had just happened. Most were fine, some needed oxygen support. All were alive and safe because someone had taken charge when the normal systems failed. Santos sat with Rodriguez near the ambulances, both of them watching Sarah coordinate with emergency responders. She was speaking with the fire chief, providing detailed information about building layout, evacuation routes, the location of people who might still be inside. Her knowledge of the facility's infrastructure was comprehensive, specific, the kind of information that came from systematic reconnaissance rather than casual familiarity. She knew, Rodriguez said quietly. The service corridor, the weight limits, the direct route to the loading dock, she knew all of it before today. Santos nodded slowly. And the way she organized everyone, that wasn't improvised. She's done tactical evacuations before. They watched as Sarah gestured toward specific areas of the building, apparently explaining to emergency personnel where the fire was likely concentrated and what areas might be structurally compromised. Her assessment was detailed, technical, delivered with the confidence of someone who understood both building systems and fire behavior. Military? Santos asked. Rodriguez shook her head. Maybe, but not standard military. The way she took command, the systematic approach, the automatic threat assessment, that special operations thinking, high-level tactical training. As they talked, a black SUV pulled into the emergency vehicle staging area. Not unusual during a major incident, various agencies responded to chemical fires, insurance investigators, facility management. But this vehicle had government plates and 2 occupants who moved with the kind of purpose that suggested official interest rather than routine response. The passengers were both men, one older with gray at his temples, one younger with the bearing of active-duty military. They wore civilian clothes, but carried themselves with unmistakable authority. They spoke briefly with the incident commander, showed credentials that caused immediate cooperation, then began scanning the evacuated personnel with systematic attention. Their eyes found Sarah within seconds. The older man stopped mid-conversation, his expression shifting from routine assessment to sharp focus. He said something to his companion, who immediately pulled out a secure phone and began making calls. Not to local emergency services. This was something else, something that required different kinds of clearance and communication. Sarah noticed the attention. Of course she did. Someone with her training would automatically track new arrivals, assess potential threats, monitor changing dynamics in any situation. She saw the men, saw their immediate interest in her, understood that her careful anonymity was about to end. She finished her conversation with the fire chief and began walking toward the SUV. Not running, not avoiding, just moving with the kind of deliberate purpose that came from someone who understood that certain conversations were inevitable once certain people recognized you. Santos and Rodriguez watched the interaction develop, their tactical instincts telling them that something significant was happening. The two men weren't emergency responders, they weren't facility management, they were something else, something connected to Sarah's real identity. "Who do you think they are?" Santos asked. Rodriguez studied the men's bearing, their equipment, their coordination with official responders. "Federal, maybe DOD, the kind of people who show up when someone classified gets exposed." As Sarah approached the SUV, the older man stepped forward. From this distance, Santos and Rodriguez couldn't hear the conversation, but they could read body language, recognition, confirmation, discussion of something that required immediate attention. Sarah nodded several times, then gestured back toward the evacuated veterans. The younger man made additional phone calls while the older one continued talking with Sarah. Their posture was respectful but urgent. Not arresting her, not confronting her, but definitely managing a situation that had developed beyond normal parameters. After several minutes, Sarah walked back toward the grouped veterans. Her expression was neutral, controlled, but Santos thought he detected something in her eyes. Not fear exactly, but resignation. The recognition that whatever cover story she had been living was about to end. She approached Santos and Rodriguez directly, stopping a few feet away. "I need to go with those men," she said simply. "Official business that can't wait." Rodriguez looked at her steadily. "Are you in trouble?" Sarah shook her head. "No, but my time here is over." Santos struggled to his feet, using his walker for support. "Who are you really?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, looking at the two veterans who had been through their own hell and come out the other side. Who understood something about service and sacrifice and the cost of doing work that most people would never know about. Someone who needed to remember what it felt like to help people without it being classified, she said finally. It wasn't an answer exactly, but it was honest. More honest than anything she had been able to say since arriving at the facility 6 months ago. Rodriguez and Santos absorbed it, understanding that they were getting the truth, even if it wasn't the complete truth. "The evacuation," Rodriguez said, "that was military-level crisis management, special operations competence." Sarah nodded slowly. "Yeah." "Combat experience?" Another nod. Santos looked toward the black SUV where the two men were waiting patiently but obviously eager to leave. "Are we going to see you again?" Sarah's expression softened just slightly. "Probably not. But thank you for letting me be useful here, for letting me help without asking too many questions. It meant more than you know." She turned and walked back toward the SUV, her limp barely noticeable now that she wasn't trying to hide her natural movement patterns. Santos and Rodriguez watched her go, their minds processing everything they had observed, everything they had learned about someone who had been hiding in plain sight for months. "Special operations," Santos said quietly. "Had to be. The tactical thinking, the automatic command presence, the way she knew exactly what to do when everything went to hell." Rodriguez nodded. "Question is, what kind of special operations, and why was she here pretending to be a civilian volunteer?" As the SUV pulled away with Sarah inside, other veterans began gathering around Santos and Rodriguez, drawn by their obvious discussion of something significant. People who had been evacuated by Sarah's organization, who had seen her transform from quiet volunteer to crisis commander in a matter of minutes. "Anyone else notice that she moved completely differently during the emergency?" asked Peterson, a former Navy corpsman who had been assisting with medical triage. "No limp, different posture, totally different bearing." "The limp was real," Rodriguez said thoughtfully, "but she wasn't letting it limit her when it mattered. That takes serious mental conditioning. the kind you get from places where mission success matters more than personal comfort. Word began spreading among the evacuated veterans, not gossip, not speculation, but tactical assessment based on what they had observed, professional recognition of capability that went far beyond volunteer training, understanding that someone had been operating among them who belonged to a different tier of experience altogether. By the time emergency responders declared the building safe and began allowing people back inside, every veteran present understood that Sarah Chen, whatever her real name was, had been something more than she appeared, someone whose presence at the rehabilitation facility had been part of something larger, something they weren't cleared to know about. But they also understood that she had been genuinely helpful, that whatever official purpose had brought her there, she had used her time to make a real difference in people's lives. She had helped them learn to walk again, to rebuild their mobility, to recover their independence. And when crisis hit, she had made sure everyone got home safe. That mattered more than questions about classification or cover stories or official explanations. She had been there when they needed someone competent and reliable. She had done the work without seeking credit or recognition. And when everything went wrong, she had stepped up and taken care of people who needed taking care of. In the military community, that was enough. That was everything. But for Santos and Rodriguez, who had been closest to her during the evacuation, questions remained. What kind of operations required that level of tactical competence? What kind of service left someone with physical injuries but intact crisis management skills? What kind of background created someone who could blend into civilian volunteer work for months without anyone recognizing their true capability? The answers to those questions were still coming, because while Sarah was being debriefed by people with appropriate clearances, someone else was arriving at the facility, someone whose job it was to manage situations exactly like this one, someone who knew exactly who Sarah really was and why her exposure during the emergency evacuation required immediate attention and careful damage control, someone who carried the kind of authority that could reshape the entire narrative of what had happened today, and who understood the implications of a Medal of Honor recipient being recognized while operating under deep cover in a civilian capacity. General Marcus Hayes arrived at Walter Reed Veterans Rehabilitation Center at 17:30 hours, exactly 90 minutes after the initial emergency call. His convoy consisted of 2 black SUVs and a military police escort, the kind of official presence that turned routine incidents into classified situations requiring immediate containment and management. Hayes was a man who had spent 42 years in the Army, rising from enlisted infantry to 4-star command through a combination of tactical brilliance and political acumen that few officers managed to balance successfully. He had overseen special operations in 3 theaters, managed classified programs that existed only in compartmentalized files, and dealt with situations where operational security and human factors created complications that textbook solutions couldn't address. This was one of those situations. He stepped out of the lead SUV and immediately began receiving briefings from multiple sources simultaneously. The facility administrator explaining the fire and evacuation, the incident commander detailing emergency response protocols, his own intelligence officer providing preliminary assessment of exposure levels and potential security implications. But Hayes's attention was focused on the group of veterans still gathered near the loading dock, specifically on Staff Sergeant Santos and Corporal Rodriguez, who were clearly the informal leadership among the evacuees. In situations like this, ground truth came from people who had been present during the incident, who had observed what actually happened rather than what was supposed to happen according to protocol. He walked directly toward them, his aide and security detail maintaining discreet distance. Hayes had learned long ago that soldiers responded better to direct engagement than formal intimidation, especially soldiers who had earned their own credibility through service and sacrifice. "Sergeant Santos, Corporal Rodriguez," he said, acknowledging them with the kind of recognition that came from reviewing their service records during the drive to the facility. "I understand you were present during the evacuation. I need to understand exactly what happened." Santos and Rodriguez exchanged glances. They knew authority when they saw it, understood that this conversation had implications beyond routine incident reporting. but they also recognized that Hayes was asking for their assessment, not demanding compliance with a predetermined narrative. "Sir, the fire alarm went off around 1547, Rodriguez began. "Primary exits were compromised by smoke. Standard evacuation protocols weren't adequate for the number of mobility-limited personnel in the facility." "And then?" Santos picked up the narrative. "One of the volunteers took charge, organized tactical evacuation through the service corridor, set up teams, assigned roles, managed the entire operation like it was a military exercise. Everyone got out safe because she knew what she was doing." Hayes's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes sharpened. "This volunteer. Describe her." "Asian American woman, maybe early 30s, slight limp on her right side," Rodriguez said. "Goes by Sarah Chen. Been working here about 6 months, helping with mobility therapy. Quiet, competent, never caused any issues. Until today. Until today, she demonstrated tactical command capabilities that don't match her supposed background," Santos said carefully. "Crisis management, resource allocation, team coordination, special operations level competence." Hayes nodded slowly. This matched the preliminary reports he had received during the drive. What concerned him was not just the exposure of a classified operator, but the implications of that exposure for ongoing operations and future mission security. "Where is she now?" he asked. "Left with 2 federal agents about an hour ago," Rodriguez replied. "Said it was official business that couldn't wait." Hayes gestured to his aide, who immediately began coordinating communication with the debrief team. But before he could continue the conversation, another voice interrupted from behind him. "General Hayes, I'm Janet Mills, volunteer coordinator. I need to understand what's happening here." Hayes turned to face a civilian woman in her 50s who looked shaken but determined. Janet Mills had spent the past hour trying to process what she had witnessed, the transformation of a quiet volunteer into someone who had managed a crisis with military precision. She deserved answers, but she also represented a security risk that required careful management. "Ms. Mills, I understand you've been Sarah Chen's supervisor during her time here." "Yes, for about 6 months. She's been exemplary, reliable, competent, popular with the veterans. But today," Janet paused, clearly struggling with what she had observed. "Today she was someone completely different. The way she took charge, the knowledge she demonstrated, the authority she carried. None of it matches what I know about her background." Hayes studied Janet's face, recognizing the confusion of someone whose worldview had been fundamentally challenged by evidence that didn't fit their understanding of reality. This was the civilian side of exposure incidents, collateral awareness that required management without creating additional security compromises. "Ms. Mills, some people have backgrounds that can't be fully disclosed for security reasons. Sometimes those people need to operate in civilian capacities for purposes that serve the greater good. What matters is whether Ms. Chen performed her volunteer duties effectively and whether she conducted herself professionally during her time here." Janet nodded slowly. "She did. Both. But I feel like I never really knew who she was." "Sometimes," Hayes said gently, "that's intentional. Sometimes people serve in ways that require anonymity, even from the people they're helping. What you saw today was someone whose training took over during a crisis, training that served everyone well." It was a careful explanation that acknowledged reality without revealing classified details. Janet absorbed it, beginning to understand that Sarah Chen, whatever her real name was, had been something more than a volunteer, but that the something more wasn't threatening to the people she had been helping. Hayes turned back to Santos and Rodriguez. "I need you both to understand something. What you witnessed today involves national security considerations that require discretion, not silence. You're free to discuss the emergency evacuation and Ms. Chen's effective crisis management. But speculation about her specific background or current status could compromise ongoing operations." Rodriguez met his eyes steadily. "Sir, we understand operational security, but we also understand when someone has taken care of us. Whatever she really is, she helped wounded veterans for 6 months without asking for anything in return. When things went bad, she made sure everyone got home safe. That matters to us," Santos nodded agreement. We're not going to cause problems for someone who stepped up when it counted, but we're also not going to pretend we didn't see what we saw. Hayes appreciated their position. These were veterans who understood service and sacrifice, who recognized competence when they saw it, who could distinguish between legitimate security concerns and administrative cover-up. They would honor operational security requirements while maintaining their own integrity about what they had experienced. Fair enough, he said. What you saw was real. The person you knew as Sarah Chen is someone who has served this country in ways that can't be publicly acknowledged. Her presence here served multiple purposes, including her own recovery from service-related injuries. The work she did with you was genuine, even if her background wasn't fully disclosed. It was more information than Hayes would normally provide to unauthorized personnel, but Santos and Rodriguez had earned the right to understand context. They had been helped by someone whose identity was classified, and they deserved to know that their gratitude was directed towards someone who had earned it through genuine service and sacrifice. Rodriguez looked toward the building where she had spent months learning to navigate the world from a wheelchair, where Sarah had patiently helped her develop upper body strength and transfer techniques and the psychological resilience to rebuild independence after devastating injury. Is she going to be okay? Rodriguez asked. After today, after being exposed? Hayes was quiet for a moment, considering how much truth he could share. People like her operate in dangerous spaces. Exposure creates risks that have to be managed carefully. But she's competent, she's experienced, and she has support from people who understand what she's been through. She'll adapt. It wasn't complete reassurance, but it was honest. Santos and Rodriguez understood that some questions didn't have comfortable answers, that people who operated in classified spaces faced risks that extended beyond the missions themselves. As Hayes prepared to conclude the conversation, his aide approached with an urgent expression. "Sir, we have an issue. Local media is picking up the evacuation story. They're specifically asking about the volunteer who organized the evacuation. Questions about her background, her training, why she was so effective during the crisis." Hayes felt his jaw tighten. Media interest was exactly the kind of exposure that turned manageable security incidents into public relations nightmares. Once reporters started asking questions about Sarah's background, once they began investigating her supposed civilian identity, the careful cover story would unravel quickly. "Timeline?" he asked. "First news van arrived 15 minutes ago, 2 more en route. Local stations are running the story on evening news. Social media posts from facility staff are already circulating." Hayes looked around the facility, noting the emergency vehicles, the gathered veterans, the obvious signs of a significant incident. Too many witnesses, too much activity, too much evidence that something unusual had happened. Containment was no longer possible. Management was the only option. "Change of plans," he said to his aide. "We're going full disclosure, controlled narrative, official channels, complete transparency about what can be revealed." Santos and Rodriguez watched this exchange, understanding that decisions were being made that would affect not just Sarah, but everyone who had been present during the evacuation. The story was going to become public, which meant their role as witnesses was about to become much more complicated. "What do you need from us?" Rodriguez asked. Hayes looked at her with respect. "The truth. Exactly what happened, exactly how she helped you, exactly why everyone got out safe. The real story, without speculation about classified details." Santos nodded. "We can do that. She saved people today. That's the story that matters." As evening settled over the facility and media attention continued to build, Hayes understood that the next few hours would determine not just how this incident was managed, but how it would affect ongoing operations and future mission security. Sarah Chen's cover was blown, but her actions during the evacuation had been heroic in ways that couldn't be denied or classified. The challenge now was managing the revelation of her true identity in a way that honored her service while protecting operational security. The truth was about to come out. The question was whether it would be the whole truth and whether the country was ready to understand what kinds of people served in the shadows to keep everyone else safe. By 1900 hours, Walter Reed Veterans Rehabilitation Center had transformed from a quiet medical facility into the epicenter of a story that was spreading across military networks faster than official communication channels could manage it. Local news crews had set up outside the main entrance, their cameras capturing interviews with evacuated personnel who spoke about the mystery volunteer who had saved lives through tactical competence that defied her supposed civilian background. But the real story was unfolding inside the facility, in Conference Room C, where General Hayes had assembled everyone who had direct knowledge of Sarah Chen's actions during the evacuation. 23 veterans, 6 facility staff members, 4 emergency responders, and 2 federal agents who had been debriefing Sarah for the past 3 hours. Hayes stood at the front of the room, his expression grave, his bearing formal. Behind him, a large screen displayed an official military photograph that no one in the room had seen before. A woman in army dress blues, her chest decorated with ribbons that told a story of courage under fire. The same woman they had known as Sarah Chen, but wearing the insignia of a captain and displaying medals that included a Purple Heart, a Bronze Star with V device, and at the center, the distinctive light blue ribbon of the Medal of Honor. The room was absolutely silent. Veterans who had spent months working with Sarah stared at the photograph, trying to reconcile the quiet volunteer they knew with the decorated soldier on the screen. Staff members who had supervised her daily activities struggled to process the reality that they had been directing someone whose service record exceeded that of most general officers. "This is Captain Elena Vasquez," Hayes announced, his voice carrying the weight of official revelation. U.S. Army Special Forces, deployed to Afghanistan from 2019 to 2022. Specialist in direct action operations, hostage rescue, and high-value target elimination. Awarded the Medal of Honor for actions taken during Operation Midnight Eagle, a classified mission in Helmand Province that resulted in the successful extraction of captured NATO personnel. He clicked to the next slide, which showed a tactical map marked with red zones and movement indicators. On September 15, 2022, Captain Vasquez's team was tasked with extracting 3 captured intelligence officers from a Taliban-controlled compound. The mission was compromised before insertion. Intelligence indicated the hostages had been executed. Command ordered mission abort. Santos felt his stomach drop. The language was familiar. Classified operations, compromised intelligence, difficult command decisions. But hearing it in connection with someone he had known personally, someone who had patiently helped him learn to walk with a prosthetic leg, made the reality of special operations work, suddenly concrete in a way it had never been before. Captain Vasquez argued for proceeding with the extraction, Hayes continued. She was overruled. Official records indicate the mission was scrubbed and the team returned to base without contact with enemy forces. Rodriguez leaned forward in her wheelchair, her expression intent. But that's not what really happened. Hayes met her eyes steadily. No, that's not what really happened. The next slide showed helmet camera footage, grainy and green-tinted from night vision equipment. A figure moving through hostile terrain, carrying combat gear, approaching a fortified position. The timestamp indicated 347 hours, approximately 6 hours after the official mission abort. Captain Vasquez went in alone, without authorization, without backup, without official support of any kind. She penetrated a Taliban stronghold defended by approximately 20 fighters, located the 3 hostages who were still alive, and began the extraction process. The footage continued, showing tactical movement through dark corridors, the systematic neutralization of enemy positions, the careful extraction of wounded personnel who could barely move. Hayes narrated the action with clinical precision, but everyone in the room could feel the tension, could understand that they were watching someone risk everything based on nothing more than instinct and determination. The hostages were severely injured but alive. Captain Vasquez had to carry them out individually, a distance of approximately 4 miles through hostile territory to the emergency extraction point. During the 3rd extraction run, the compound was struck by an IED that had been rigged as a booby trap. The footage went white for several seconds, then showed chaos, debris, smoke, the aftermath of an explosion that should have been fatal. When the image cleared, it showed Captain Vasquez, Elena, partially buried under rubble, her uniform torn, blood visible on her back and right leg. She was critically injured but continued the mission. She carried the third hostage to the extraction point, secured the area until medical evacuation arrived, and provided tactical intelligence that allowed follow-up operations to neutralize the remaining hostile forces in the area. Hayes paused the footage and turned back to face the room. The IED blast caused severe injuries to her spine, her right leg, and internal organs. She spent 8 months in military hospitals, underwent 14 surgeries, and was medically retired from active duty. The mission remained classified. The hostages were returned to their families with a cover story about successful negotiation rather than tactical extraction. Janet Mills, who had supervised Sarah's volunteer work for 6 months, raised a shaking hand. The limp, her injuries, everything we thought was civilian trauma, was the result of combat injuries sustained while saving 3 lives under impossible circumstances, Hayes confirmed. Captain Vasquez requested that her Medal of Honor ceremony be conducted privately, without media attention. She wanted to transition to civilian life without public recognition that might compromise her ability to operate in the future. Santos struggled to his feet, his prosthetic leg suddenly feeling insignificant compared to the injuries that Elena had sustained and overcome. She's been helping us recover from our service injuries while dealing with her own. For 6 months. Every day. Without ever mentioning what she went through. "Because," said a new voice from the back of the room, "that's not why I was here." Everyone turned. Elena Vasquez, no longer Sarah Chen, stood in the doorway. She wore simple civilian clothes, her limp visible but her posture upright, her expression calm but different somehow. More open, less guarded, as if the revelation of her identity had lifted a weight she had been carrying. She walked slowly into the room, moving past the assembled veterans and staff members who watched her with expressions that ranged from awe to confusion to something approaching reverence. She stopped in front of the screen displaying her official photograph and service record. "I wasn't here to be recognized," she said quietly. "I wasn't here to be thanked. I was here because after 3 years of operations, where success was measured in body counts and intelligence gathered and threats neutralized, I needed to remember what it felt like to help people heal instead of helping them die." The room remained silent, but the quality of silence had changed. This wasn't shock or confusion anymore. This was recognition. Understanding. The veterans in the room, people who had given pieces of themselves in service to their country, recognized someone who had given more than most and asked for nothing in return. Rodriguez wheeled her chair closer to Elena, her expression serious. "You helped me learn to transfer from my wheelchair independently. You spotted me during upper body exercises. You listened when I talked about missing the work I used to do as a medic, about feeling useless in civilian life." Elena nodded. "Because I understood. Because I was struggling with the same things." Santos stepped forward, still using his walker for support. "The day I fell, when I was working on the parallel bars, you caught me before I hit the floor. You moved like someone who had been trained to respond to developing threats," Elena finished, "because I had been. But in that moment, you weren't a threat to be neutralized. You were a person who needed help, and I could provide it. That meant everything to me." Hayes watched the interaction with growing understanding. This hadn't been a covert operation or a classified assignment. This had been rehabilitation of a different kind. Elena Vasquez had come to the veterans' facility not to hide, but to heal, to rebuild her connection to the human cost of the work she had done, to remember why that work mattered. General Hayes stepped forward, his movement formal and deliberate. "Captain Vasquez." She turned to face him, her posture straightening automatically into military bearing. "Sir, what you did today, organizing the evacuation, ensuring everyone's safety, that was exceptional work under pressure. But it was also exposure of classified personnel in a civilian environment. That creates complications." Elena met his eyes steadily. "Yes, sir, I understand." Hayes studied her face, recognizing the look of someone who had accepted consequences before they were delivered. someone who understood that operational security sometimes required personal sacrifice. However, he continued, the nature of your exposure, saving lives during a crisis, makes certain responses inappropriate. You can't be disciplined for heroic action, even if that action compromised your cover. Elena's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes suggested relief. Not because she had avoided consequences, but because her actions were being recognized as legitimate rather than problematic. Hayes straightened his own posture, his voice taking on the formal tone of official recognition. Captain Elena Vasquez, on behalf of the United States Army and the veterans whose lives you saved today, both during the evacuation and during your 6 months of service at this facility, I want to express my gratitude. He brought his hand up slowly, deliberately, into a full formal salute. Not the casual acknowledgement between officers, but the kind of salute reserved for exceptional service, for actions that exceeded duty and approached heroism. Elena stood perfectly still for a moment, processing the recognition. Then, despite being in civilian clothes, despite being medically retired, despite 6 months of careful anonymity, she returned the salute with precision that spoke of years of training and pride of service that had never been diminished by injury or secrecy. The salute held for 5 seconds, 10, 15, time stretching as everyone in the room understood they were witnessing something significant, not just protocol, but respect, recognition of service that had been hidden, sacrifice that had been unacknowledged, heroism that had been classified. And then, from somewhere in the middle of the room, Santos began to clap. Not polite applause, not ceremony clapping, but the slow, deliberate recognition that came from someone who understood exactly what kind of courage it took to carry wounded people through hostile territory, to risk everything for people you barely knew, to spend months helping others recover from trauma while dealing with your own. Rodriguez joined him, her applause strong and steady. Then, the other veterans, one by one, recognizing someone who had earned their respect not through rank or reputation, but through consistent presence and genuine care. The facility staff followed, understanding finally why their quiet volunteer had been so competent, so reliable, so naturally effective at helping people recover their strength and independence. The applause built until it filled the room, until it became a sustained expression of gratitude and respect that went far beyond polite ceremony. Elena stood at the front, receiving recognition she had never sought, acknowledgement she had never requested, gratitude she had never expected. But what moved her most wasn't the applause itself. It was the faces of the people providing it, veterans she had helped learn to walk again, staff members who had trusted her with their patients' care, emergency responders who had seen her organize a flawless evacuation under pressure, people who knew her not as a classified operator or a decorated soldier, but as someone who had shown up consistently, who had done the work without seeking credit, who had stepped up when crisis demanded leadership. For 6 months, she had been trying to remember what it felt like to be valued for helping rather than fighting, to be appreciated for healing rather than destroying, to be recognized for presence rather than absence. Now she knew. The conference room had quieted after the extended applause, but the energy remained high, a combination of respect, admiration, and the kind of emotional release that came after months of partial truth finally giving way to complete honesty. Elena remained at the front of the room, still processing the reality that her carefully maintained cover had been not just blown, but replaced with something she had never expected: public recognition. General Hayes was preparing to continue the briefing when his aide approached with an urgent expression and whispered something that made Hayes's jaw tighten. He nodded once, then addressed the room with the kind of formal authority that indicated a situation requiring immediate management. "We have additional personnel arriving on site who need to be briefed on today's developments," he announced. "I'm going to ask everyone to remain here while we coordinate with facility administration and media management." Elena felt her stomach drop. Additional personnel meant oversight, meant people with clearances and authority who would be less concerned with her emotional rehabilitation and more focused on the security implications of her exposure. The past 3 hours of debriefing had been professional, but respectful. What was coming next would be different. The conference room door opened, and Captain Bradley Morrison entered, flanked by the same two lieutenants who had been part of the morning's tour group. Morrison's expression was carefully controlled, but Elena could see tension in his posture, confusion in his eyes. He'd clearly been briefed on the basic facts, but understanding those facts intellectually and accepting them emotionally were different challenges. Morrison stopped just inside the doorway, his gaze moving around the room before settling on Elena. Recognition flickered across his face. The same woman he had dismissed that morning as an inadequate volunteer, now standing at the front of a military briefing wearing civilian clothes, but commanding obvious respect from a four-star general. Hayes gestured for Morrison to approach. "Captain Morrison, you were present during the incident this morning involving questions about volunteer qualifications. I believe you need to understand what actually happened." Morrison walked forward slowly, his mind clearly racing through the implications of what he was seeing. That morning, he had questioned Elena's suitability to help wounded veterans based on her visible limp and assumed civilian background. Now, he was in a room where that same woman was being briefed by General Hayes as if she were a critical military asset. "Sir," Morrison said carefully, "I was briefed that there was a security incident involving a classified operator, but I wasn't given details about identity or background." Hayes nodded toward Elena. "Captain Morrison, meet Captain Elena Vasquez, U.S. Army Special Forces, Medal of Honor recipient, medically retired following combat injuries sustained during a classified hostage rescue operation in Afghanistan." Morrison's face went pale. He looked at Elena, then at the screen still displaying her service record, then back at Elena. The mathematical reality of the situation was beginning to penetrate. The woman he had publicly criticized for being inadequately qualified to help veterans was herself a veteran, whose service record exceeded that of most officers in active duty. "Sir, Morrison started, then stopped. There were no words that could adequately address the magnitude of his error. He had questioned the qualifications of a Medal of Honor recipient. He had suggested that her physical limitations disqualified her from helping wounded warriors. He had done this in front of patients, in front of staff, in front of other officers. Elena watched Morrison process the situation, recognizing the particular kind of shock that came from discovering you had been completely wrong about something important. She had seen it before in operational contexts, the moment when assumptions proved incorrect and reality reasserted itself with uncomfortable clarity. "Captain Morrison," Elena said quietly, "you questioned my qualifications this morning. You suggested that my limp made me unsuitable to help wounded veterans. You recommended that I be assigned to clerical work rather than direct patient interaction." Morrison nodded stiffly, his face flushed with embarrassment and something that might have been shame. "Yes, ma'am, I did." "Why?" The question was simple, direct, delivered without hostility, but it forced Morrison to examine his assumptions, to articulate the reasoning that had seemed obvious that morning, but now appeared deeply flawed. Morrison was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with how to explain thinking that now seemed not just wrong but insulting. I made assumptions based on visible limitations. I thought that helping wounded veterans required someone who could relate to their experience through prior military service. And you assumed I lacked that service." "Yes, ma'am." Elena nodded slowly. "What else did you assume?" Morrison's discomfort was obvious, but he answered honestly. "That your physical condition indicated weakness, that you couldn't provide the kind of strong support that wounded warriors deserved, that you were inadequate for the work." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Everyone in the room understood the irony. Morrison had deemed inadequate someone whose courage and competence far exceeded his own, whose service record included actions that most officers would never be asked to perform. Santos, still standing with his walker, spoke from the middle of the room. "Sir, with respect, Captain Vasquez spent 6 months helping wounded veterans rebuild their mobility and independence. She was competent, patient, and effective. Every single day. She helped me learn to walk with a prosthetic leg. She spotted me during exercises when I was afraid of falling. She never once made me feel like my limitations were permanent or shameful." Rodriguez wheeled her chair closer. She helped me develop the upper body strength to transfer independently from my wheelchair. She listened when I talked about feeling useless after my injury. She made me understand that recovery was possible, that I could rebuild my life around what I could do rather than what I couldn't. Other veterans began speaking up, their voices overlapping as they described the consistent care and support Elena had provided. Professional competence combined with personal understanding. Technical knowledge delivered with genuine empathy. The kind of help that came from someone who understood limitation from personal experience, not theoretical training. Morrison listened to the testimonials with growing understanding of how fundamentally wrong his assessment had been. These wounded veterans, people whose opinions should matter more than anyone else's, were describing Elena as exactly the kind of support they needed. Someone who combined professional competence with personal experience of recovery from combat injury. Hayes allowed the testimonials to continue for several minutes, then raised his hand for silence. Captain Morrison, you made assumptions about Captain Vasquez's qualifications based on incomplete information. Those assumptions led to recommendations that would have removed an exceptionally qualified person from work she was performing successfully. Morrison nodded miserably. Yes, sir. What does that teach you about the relationship between visible limitation and actual capability? Morrison was quiet for a long moment, clearly processing implications that extended far beyond this specific incident. That visible limitation doesn't indicate incapability, that assumptions based on partial observation can be completely wrong, that the most qualified person for a job might not look like what you expect. Hayes studied Morrison's face, recognizing genuine understanding rather than reflexive agreement. Captain Morrison, you have a choice to make. You can treat this as an embarrassing mistake that you hope people forget, or you can treat it as a learning experience that changes how you evaluate people in situations going forward. Morrison straightened his posture, his expression becoming more determined. Sir, I choose to learn from it. He turned to face Elena directly, his movement deliberate and formal. Captain Vasquez, I owe you an apology, not just for questioning your qualifications, but for doing so in a way that was public and dismissive. I made assumptions based on incomplete information, and those assumptions were wrong in every possible way. Elena met his eyes steadily. Apology. Accepted, Captain. Morrison continued, his voice gaining strength as he worked through what needed to be said. More than that, I owe you gratitude. You've spent 6 months providing exactly the kind of support these veterans needed, and you did it without seeking recognition or credit. You demonstrated the kind of service that I should aspire to rather than question. He paused, clearly debating whether to continue, then decided to complete his thought. And today, during the emergency evacuation, you saved lives through competence and leadership that I hope I would demonstrate if faced with a similar crisis. Elena appreciated the honesty, the willingness to admit error and learn from it. Morrison's assumptions had been wrong, but they hadn't been malicious. They had been the product of limited experience and surface-level observation, mistakes that could be corrected through exposure to broader perspectives. Captain Morrison, Elena said, I want you to understand something. The assumptions you made about my limitations, those same assumptions are made about every veteran in this room every day. People see Santos's prosthetic leg and assume he's less capable. They see Rodriguez's wheelchair and assume she's helpless. They see my limp and assume I'm broken. She gestured toward the assembled veterans. But every person in this room has rebuilt their life around what they can do rather than what they can't. They've developed strength and competence and resilience that most people never need to find. Your job as an officer is to recognize that strength, not dismiss it based on surface observation. Morrison nodded, clearly absorbing the lesson. How do I do that better? How do I see capability instead of limitation? Elena smiled slightly, the first time Morrison had seen her expression soften. You start by asking what someone needs to be successful rather than assuming what they can't do. You provide accommodation and support rather than limitation and exclusion. You judge performance rather than appearance. Hayes watched the exchange with approval. This was exactly the kind of learning that needed to happen, the recognition that capability came in many forms and that leadership, required the wisdom to see past surface differences to underlying strength. "Captain Morrison," Hayes said, "you're going to be temporarily assigned to this facility as a liaison officer. Your job will be to ensure that accommodation and support systems are in place for all veterans receiving services here. You'll report directly to facility administration and to my office." Morrison straightened. "Yes, sir." "And Captain Morrison, you'll be working directly with the veterans themselves to understand their perspectives on what support looks like. Not what you think they need, but what they actually need to be successful." It was both opportunity and accountability, the chance to learn from his mistake and the responsibility to ensure that learning translated into better service for wounded veterans. Morrison understood the assignment was as much about his own development as it was about facility improvement. Elena watched Morrison process his new assignment, recognizing someone who was genuinely committed to learning and growth. She had seen other officers make similar mistakes and refused to acknowledge them, doubling down on assumptions rather than accepting new information. Morrison's willingness to admit error and seek improvement suggested character that could develop into genuine leadership. As the briefing continued and Morrison was integrated into the facility's command structure, Elena felt something she had not expected: hope. Not just for Morrison's development, but for the broader possibility that people could learn to see past limitation to capability, past difference to strength, past assumption to reality. The morning had begun with dismissal and judgment. The evening was ending with recognition and respect. The transformation had been dramatic, but it was also fragile. Sustaining it would require ongoing commitment from people like Morrison, who were willing to question their assumptions and expand their understanding of what service looked like. 3 weeks later, Walter Reed Veterans Rehabilitation Center had transformed in ways both visible and subtle. The physical changes were obvious: improved accommodation systems, updated mobility equipment, expanded therapy programs designed around veteran input rather than administrative assumption. But the deeper changes were cultural, philosophical, rooted in a new understanding of what capability looked like and how it could be supported. Elena Vasquez stood in the main therapy room at 0700 just as she had every morning for the past 6 months. But now everything was different. Her volunteer badge had been replaced with official credentials as a senior rehabilitation specialist, a newly created position that recognized both her therapeutic effectiveness and her unique understanding of combat-related recovery. She no longer worked in anonymity, but her focus remained the same: helping wounded veterans rebuild their independence and confidence. The morning's first session involved a new patient, Lieutenant Sarah Kim, a Navy pilot who had lost her left arm when her aircraft was hit by small arms fire over Syria. Kim sat in a wheelchair, not because her legs were injured, but because the balance disruption from her amputation had initially made walking difficult. Her expression carried the familiar combination of anger and determination that Elena recognized from her own recovery process. "Physical therapy says I should be able to walk normally within 6 weeks, Kim said, her voice tight with frustration. "But they don't understand that normal doesn't exist anymore. Everything feels different. My center of gravity is off. My brain keeps trying to use an arm that isn't there." Elena nodded, pulling up a chair to sit at Kim's eye level rather than standing over her. "Tell me about flying before the injury. What did that feel like?" Kim's expression shifted, surprise replacing anger. "What does that have to do with walking?" "Everything," Elena said simply. "You learn to control an aircraft by developing an intuitive understanding of balance, momentum, and spatial relationships. You trusted your body to operate complex systems under pressure. That knowledge doesn't disappear because your physical structure changed. It adapts." Kim was quiet for a moment, processing this perspective. "Most people want to talk about what I can't do anymore, about limitations and realistic expectations." "I'm not most people," Elena replied. "I want to talk about what you can do and how we build on that to get you where you want to be." She stood and moved to the parallel bars where Kim would practice walking. "Flying required you to make constant micro-adjustments based on changing conditions. Weather, mechanical performance, mission requirements. You learn to adapt in real time without conscious thought. Walking with a prosthetic or significant physical change requires the same kind of adaptive learning." Kim transferred from her wheelchair to the parallel bars, her movements still uncertain but determined. How do you know so much about adaptive learning? Elena rolled up her sleeve, revealing the scar tissue on her arm from shrapnel wounds, then gestured to her right leg where the limp was visible. Because I had to learn it myself. Combat injuries, multiple surgeries, 8 months relearning how to move. Everything I'm teaching you, I learned from people who understood that recovery isn't about returning to what you were. It's about becoming something new that incorporates what you've experienced. Kim took her first steps between the parallel bars, her movement careful but more confident than it had been with previous therapists. You were deployed? Afghanistan, special forces, hostage extraction that went wrong in every possible way except the part where everyone came home alive. Elena positioned herself where she could provide support if Kim needed it. I spent months angry that my body didn't work the way it used to. Then I spent months learning that it could work differently and still be effective. And now, Elena smiled, now I help other people figure out the same thing. That different doesn't mean less capable. That adaptation is a strength, not a limitation. As Kim continued practicing, Captain Morrison entered the therapy room. His assignment as liaison officer had evolved into something more permanent and more meaningful. He spent his days working directly with veterans to understand their needs, coordinating between medical staff and patients, ensuring that accommodation requests were met promptly and effectively. "Morning, Elena," he said, then turned to Kim. "Lieutenant Kim, how are you feeling about today's session?" Kim paused in her walking practice. "Different. Better, I think." Elena understands things that other therapists don't. Morrison nodded. Over the past 3 weeks, he had heard similar comments from multiple veterans. Elena's approach to rehabilitation was consistently more effective than standard protocols, not because she had better technical training, but because she understood the psychological and emotional aspects of recovery from a personal perspective. "Elena," Morrison said, "I have an update on the accommodation request for the prosthetic workshop. Funding was approved for the expanded space and the specialized equipment. Construction starts next month." Elena looked pleased. The prosthetic workshop had been her idea, a space where veterans could learn to maintain and modify their artificial limbs, developing the technical skills and sense of control that came from understanding their own equipment. It was practical training that also provided psychological benefits, helping people feel like active participants in their recovery rather than passive recipients of care. "That's excellent," she said. "Rodriguez has been working on the curriculum design. Her medical background and her personal experience with adaptive equipment makes her perfect to lead the program." Morrison made notes on his tablet. "I'll coordinate with facility administration to ensure Rodriguez has the resources she needs." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of General Hayes, who had taken to making regular visits to the facility. Not official inspections, but informal check-ins designed to ensure that the changes implemented after Elena's exposure were producing positive results rather than just good intentions. "Good morning," Hayes said, addressing the group. "Lieutenant Kim, how's your rehabilitation progressing?" Kim straightened her posture automatically. "Very well, sir. Elena's approach is different from what I experienced at other facilities, more focused on capability development rather than limitation management." Hayes nodded, making his own notes. This was the kind of feedback he had been hearing consistently. Veterans responding positively to Elena's integration into the official staff structure, rehabilitation outcomes improving, overall morale in the facility higher than it had been in years. "Elena, I need to speak with you privately," Hayes said. "Captain Morrison, please continue coordinating Lieutenant Kim's session." Elena followed Hayes out of the therapy room and into the facility's main conference area. Through the windows, she could see the memorial wall where photographs of fallen service members created a reminder of sacrifice and service that extended far beyond individual recovery. "How are you adjusting to the transition from classified operator to public rehabilitation specialist?" Hayes asked directly. Elena considered the question carefully. "It's different. More visible, more accountable to civilian oversight, more integrated with normal institutional structures. But the work itself feels more sustainable, more connected to something positive." Hayes studied her expression. Any regrets about the exposure? About losing the anonymity that allowed you to operate in classified environments? No, Elena said without hesitation. That work was necessary, and I was effective at it. But it was also isolating in ways that I didn't fully understand until I had something to compare it to. This work connects me to people in ways that create meaning rather than just mission success. Hayes nodded slowly. I'm asking because we're developing protocols for transitioning special operations personnel into civilian support roles. Your experience here has been successful enough that we want to understand what made it work, what challenges arose, and how to replicate the positive outcomes. Elena felt a surge of interest. You're thinking about creating programs that help operators transition out of classified work? We're recognizing that people who spend years in high-stress compartmentalized operations need structured support to reintegrate with civilian communities. Your rehabilitation here, both personal and professional, suggests that meaningful work in veteran support roles might be an effective bridge. It was an interesting development, the recognition that operators like Elena needed their own form of rehabilitation, their own path back from the isolation and moral complexity that came with classified work. The idea that transition could be structured and supported rather than simply expected. What would that look like? Elena asked. Hayes pulled out a folder containing preliminary program documents. Gradual transition from classified to civilian roles, structured integration with veteran support organizations, professional development that builds on operational skills while channeling them toward healing rather than combat applications. Psychological support that addresses the specific challenges of moving from classified to open environments. Elena reviewed the documents, recognizing the thoughtfulness behind the approach. This assumes that operators want to transition to civilian support roles. Some do, some don't. But everyone deserves the choice, and everyone deserves support in making that choice successfully. Hayes paused, then continued. We're asking if you would consider leading the pilot program, developing the protocols, training the support staff, creating the framework that could be replicated at other facilities. Elena felt something shift inside her, a sense of purpose that went beyond individual recovery or even individual support for other veterans. This was the possibility of systemic change, of creating pathways that could help other operators find their way back from the isolation that came with classified work. I would need to maintain my work here, she said. The direct patient interaction, the hands-on rehabilitation support. That can't be just administrative. Understood. This would leadership that grows out of continued practice, not leadership that replaces practice. Elena looked back toward the therapy room where Lieutenant Kim was continuing her walking practice under Captain Morrison's supervision. The scene represented everything that had changed over the past 3 weeks. Wounded veterans receiving support from people who understood their experience, accommodation systems that focused on capability rather than limitation, leadership that prioritized veteran needs over administrative convenience. Yes, she said. I'll lead the pilot program. Hayes smiled, the first time Elena had seen his expression soften since meeting him. Outstanding. We'll start with facility integration here, then expand to other locations based on what we learn. As they finished discussing implementation details, Elena realized that her journey from classified operator to rehabilitation specialist to program leader represented something larger than personal transition. It was proof that people could change, that institutions could adapt, that service could take many forms and still be meaningful. The morning sun continued to rise over the facility, casting light through windows onto veterans who were rebuilding their lives, staff members who were learning to see capability instead of limitation, and systems that were evolving to support recovery rather than simply managing it. Elena's story had begun with hidden identity and careful anonymity. It was ending with recognition, purpose, and the possibility that her experience could create pathways for others who needed to find their way back from places where service required sacrifice that couldn't be acknowledged. She had learned to walk again after combat injuries. She had helped others learn to walk again after their own trauma. Now, she would help create systems that supported walking forward, not just for individual veterans, but for entire communities of people who had given pieces of themselves in service to something larger. The limp would always be there, a reminder of the cost of courage. But it was no longer something to hide or overcome. It was evidence of survival, adaptation, and the kind of strength that grew from accepting limitation and building capability around it. In the end, that might be the most important lesson of all. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe for more military and veteran stories. These true tales keep the courage alive for generations to come. And in the comments, tell us where are you watching from and who's the quiet leader you'll never forget.